Hello, everybody. Afterwards, we'll be speaking in German, so I will be giving my talk, however, in English. So first, just apologize for that, but our conversation will be in German. I would like to thank Eva Maria Holzleitner for welcoming us to this beautiful chamber, beautiful building. I know it's been newly renovated, the seat of Austrian democracy, so it's really a great honor to be here. And also thank the invitation from the Renner Institute and Sebastian and everybody at the Renner Institute who invited me and welcomed me. I've been here for the day and been enjoying the sunny weather and really enjoying myself. So I want to talk to you this evening about how democracies can defend themselves against threats from inside. Democracies don't die like they used to. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns, army generals, for example, seizing power. Today, most democracies die at the hands of elected officials, elected leaders, presidents, prime ministers, who use the very institutions of democracy to undermine it. So this is Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Erdogan in Turkey, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Modi in India. This means the principal threat to democracy today comes from within. Now, it's true that democracies are always vulnerable to threats from within because democracy is always premised on open competition and basic political freedoms that inevitably provide opportunities for anti-democratic forces. So a democracy can never really fully humanize itself from such threats without ceasing to be a democracy. But today there's been a large increase in the number of authoritarian figures elected across the globe. I mentioned some already: Chavez, Erdogan, Orban, Modi, Bolsonaro, and Donald Trump as well. So it's really important to think about how to protect a democracy from these kinds of figures, or sometimes political parties. So to think about that theme, tonight what I wanted to do was to talk about the United States, drawing on the recent book that I wrote that's come out in German. But I would like to then conclude, and by the end, think about more general lessons from the American experience. So American democracy faces some serious challenges today. I think this will not come as news to any of you. Americans are experiencing what political scientists call democratic backsliding. It's not severe backsliding, not the kind of backsliding that we've seen in Hungary or Turkey or India. But all major international indices register a pretty significant decline in America's democracy since about 2016. Freedom House, one organization, has a global freedom index, which gives every country in the world a democracy score ranging from 0 to 100, 100 being high. A decade ago, the United States received a score of 94 out of 100, which put it on par with Germany, Canada, Great Britain. Today, the score for the United States is 83. So it's gone from 94 to 83, which leaves the United States tied with Romania and 2 points below Argentina. Now, when I say this to American audiences, they're often very shocked. Maybe you are all shocked about this as well. But when you have government efforts to restrict the right to vote, when you have violent threats against election officials, and when you have an incumbent president who tries to block a peaceful transfer of power, then you reach a point where Freedom House gives you a score lower than Argentina. Now, that the U.S. has experienced this decline in its democracy score is really, from a social scientist, I'm a political scientist, a social scientist's point of view, pretty shocking. Social scientists have discovered really two basic facts, two rock-solid findings when they look at the world of democracies. First, rich democracies never die. No country with a GDP per capita of over $17,000 has ever broken down since the 20th century into the 21st century. The US is, of course, 4 times that level. The second seemingly rock-solid finding is that old democracies never die. In the 20th century and 21st century, no democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down. So even if we date the US as being democratic since about 1965, and that's how I think about the US, when all citizens had the right to vote after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, America is certainly older than 50. American democracy is certainly older than 50. So what all of this means is that this crisis of democracy that people sense in the United States really represents a genuine puzzle. And that puzzle is that among rich, old democracies, among the countries that the United States likes to compare itself to, of Western Europe, of Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, among this cluster of peer nations, only the United States has experienced democratic backsliding over the last 5-6 years. So why is this the case? How is it that one of the world's oldest and richest democracies has become vulnerable? So our book tries to answer that question, and we look at, broadly speaking, two main causes, two broad culprits. You can think of it this way. The first is the radicalization of one of America's political parties, the Republican Party. That's one factor. And a second factor is a set of political institutions in the United States that is arguably making the situation worse. So the first half of the book examines the Republican Party's transformation, and the second half of the book looks at the institutions. So let me first say a word about the Republican Party. Democracy can't survive for long if one of its major parties is not committed to playing by democratic rules. Now, I want to be very clear here what I mean to say that a party is no longer committed to playing by democratic rules, because one might think that this is just in the eye of the beholder, that this is very polarizing to say one party is not committed to democracy. Both sides usually make these accusations, of course, against each other. So what I want to make clear is that there actually are some very clear criteria that one can use to evaluate political parties' behavior. And this is a set of criteria that applies to the United States, and I think also could apply to Europe as well. So we draw on the great Spanish political scientist Juan Linz, who back in the 1970s wrote a book, and he proposed a set of criteria that we develop in our book, in which we argue there's three things, basically, that a political party that's committed to democracy, that's committed to democratic rules, has to do. Three things. First of all, they must accept the results of elections, win or lose. They must accept the constitutional order, in other words. Second, they must unambiguously reject political violence. And third, they must break completely with violent or anti-democratic forces, especially when it's on their own side. Now, those first two principles, accepting the constitutional order, accepting elections, is pretty straightforward, as well as not deploying violence. The third point, though, is a little bit more complicated, so I'll just spend a minute on that. Now, the point I would make here is that openly authoritarian figures can't kill a democracy on their own. They need mainstream accomplices, or what Juan Linz, the same political scientist, called semi-loyalists. So semi-loyalists are regular politicians. They're often hard to pick out in a crowd. They wear suits and ties, and they go about their business like normal politicians. In the German edition of our book, they're called the halbloyale Demokraten. I sometimes think of them as lauwarme Demokraten. Maybe it might be another term. But they put on suits, as I say. They work inside the Capitol building. They're not the ones attacking the Parliament building. But their semi-loyalty to democracy only manifests itself when authoritarian threats emerge within their own camp, on their own side. When faced with extremists in their own camp, loyal Democrats, those committed to democracy, do three things. They condemn publicly anti-democratic behavior. They expel anti-democratic extremists from their ranks, refusing to nominate them, refusing to support their candidacies. And crucially, they join forces with those on the other side of the political aisle, and those on the other side of the ideological aisle, who are also committed to democracy, to isolate anti-democratic extremists. Now, contrast this with the halbloyale or lauwarme Demokraten. What do? They do none of these things. Rather than publicly repudiating anti-democratic extremists on their own flank, they downplay it. They justify it. Or they just remain silent about it. Rather than expelling anti-democratic extremists, semi-loyalists accommodate them, protect them, or help protect them from prosecution or political isolation. And then third, crucially, they refuse to work, semi-loyalists refuse to work with ideological allies, again, those on the other side of the aisle who are also committed to democracy, and that's not normal to do that in a democracy, but they don't do this even when democracy is on the line. Now, what's really tricky about this is that semi-loyal behavior from a distance looks kind of benign, looks harmless, because it just looks like normal politics. But it poses a real threat to democracy because it emboldens, legitimizes, empowers anti-democratic extremists. And so in our studies, in our book and elsewhere, of the breakdown of democracies in the 1930s in Europe, as well as in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, there's a very clear lesson. And that lesson is that when mainstream parties of the center-left or the center-right tolerate, protect, or enable violent or anti-democratic extremists, democracies get into trouble. So if we turn back to the United States, the problem in the United States today is that there's a pretty substantial segment of voters, roughly 30% of voters, who support a radical right or anti-democratic force. This is the core of what's sometimes called the MAGA base, MAGA standing for Make America Great Again. This is the Trump base. Now, where does this base come from? Where does this 30% come from? I could talk a long time about it, but I'll just briefly say, over the past 50 years, American society has changed dramatically. It's become a much more ethnically and culturally diverse place. The percentage of Americans who identified as white and Christian fell from 80% in 1976 to 43% in 2016. So it's a big change. And as American society has changed, one of our two major parties, the Republican Party, has not. It has simply stayed frozen in place. It has a predominantly white and Christian base in a rapidly diversifying society. Now, this has two big implications. The first, electoral. Given these social changes and given the base of this party and the profile of the party, it's hard to win electorally. It's hard to win majorities, popular majorities. By the early 21st century, what remained mostly a white and Christian party could no longer win electoral majorities in the United States. Indeed, the Republicans actually haven't won a popular majority for the presidency since 2004. But the threat went beyond losing elections. For parts of the Republican base, the voting base, these social and demographic changes felt like existential challenges. Because America's transformation is one that, as far as I know, no democracy has ever undergone, is a transition in which a long dominant ethnic majority loses not only its majority position, but also its dominant social status in society. So this is there's a perception that exists among many MAGA voters that the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. That's a very powerful sense, that can be a very powerful sense of existential fear and threat that's powerful enough to turn people away from democracy. And so I think in one way to think about this, that the MAGA movement is a reaction to a diversifying America. And I think in many ways that a similar driving force fuels the radical right in Western Europe as well. But here's the key point from my perspective that's sometimes not fully appreciated. You know, if you just look at, news from a distance of the United States, you may forget that this MAGA base is only 30% of the American electorate. Maybe this seems like a lot, only 30%, but it's only 30%. It's 30% of the core of the Trump base is the 30% of the electorate. So the question then is, how does this 30%, this minority in effect, have so much influence in American politics? It's an excellent question. In fact, 20 to 30% of voters in most democracies in Western Europe as well vote for similar kinds of candidates and parties. This figure is sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but it's a near constant across established democracies. Germany, Italy, Sweden, Austria, I've just seen the Sonntagsfragen, and the United States. This 30% is a threat to democracy everywhere in a sense. I mean, voters can vote for who they want, but the candidates they vote for, the parties they vote for, can be a threat everywhere. But the puzzle in the United States, the question that concerns us as students and citizens of the United States, is how does this faction have such a grip on American democracy? And I would say there's two big reasons that it has such a grip. First, the semi-loyal, as I just described it, leadership of the Republican Party has turned the party into an enabler, empowering this base of the party. The leadership of the Republican Party has repeatedly failed in its what we call gatekeeping role. I think in the first book it was called the Torhüter. The parties are Torhüters, and it failed in this role by forming alliances with the candidate Trump, and the Trump movement in 2016 when Donald Trump was nominated president, This happened in 2021 when the Republican Party failed to complete the impeachment of Donald Trump after January 6th. And this is happening again today as we speak, as Republicans throw their support to Donald Trump and his candidacy for president, engaging in the fantasy world or make-believe world that the election of 2020 was stolen, when every judge in the United States has said that that's not the case. So semi-loyal Democrats within the Republican Party are part of the problem. And I think this should be a general warning about the dangers of these semi-loyals, halb-loyal and Democrat. So that's one reason. A second reason, though, that this 30% seems to have such influence on American politics is something about the structure of American political institutions. Now, the United States has a very old constitution. We haven't had the privilege of having two republics. It's a very old constitution. It's been around since the end of the 18th century. It's a remarkable document, deserves to be protected and appreciated, but it's always been a work in progress. And as it currently exists, there's certain features of the Constitution that amplify the power of political minorities. And at the time it was written, the Constitution, as I say, was a revolutionary document in the 18th century. It's an inspiration for republics all around the world, but it was crafted in a pre-democratic era. The word political party doesn't exist in the US Constitution because the concept really didn't exist. It was designed, the Constitution was designed, as the founders often put it, and as Tocqueville put it in the 19th century, against the tyranny of the majority, a fear of the tyranny of the majority, which is a reasonable fear to have, perhaps. But it has generated the opposite problem. More so than any other democracy on earth, electoral majorities in the United States can't win power, and when they win power, they have extreme difficulty governing. Now, you know these classic institutions, the Electoral College, which is the indirect system by which we select our president, which allows the loser, in some instances, of the popular vote to become president. A severely malapportioned Senate, our second chamber, which is not like Austria's, not like Germany's, because it provides equal representation to all states, no matter their size. So Wyoming, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Wyoming. Wyoming has about 500,000 people in it, has 2 senators. Probably more of you have been to California, with 30 to 40 million people, has also 2 senators. The Senate filibuster. This is the Senate rule within the Senate, which allows a partisan minority to permanently block legislation of a majority. This requires a supermajority to pass every single piece of legislation. And then finally, a powerful Supreme Court with extensive review powers. It's good to have a Supreme Court, but the United States is the only democracy in the world that has a Supreme Court where the justices serve for their entire lives. No term limits, no retirement ages. Now, if you're a fan of the US Constitution, like I am, you might think, well, these institutions are all by design. I mean, weren't the founding fathers brilliant? Yes, they were. There's a carefully calibrated system of checks and balances, and that's true. Some of these institutions were carefully designed, but many of them were not. Many of them were just the result of compromise, of founders in a very difficult founding moment. And these concessions and compromises built some biases into the political system. And in particular, they built a bias that by the 19th century, and certainly by the 20th century, favored rural areas over urban areas. So the Senate, with 2 senators for Wyoming and California, means that rural areas are overrepresented. The Electoral College, which also gives rural states more influence on the selection of the president. And because the president nominates the judges and the Senate confirms them, this means the judges that are sitting on the Supreme Court also disproportionately reflect rural areas. Now, this is just how it's always been, but for most of America's history, this wasn't really a major problem for party competition because both parties had urban and rural wings. But there have been a set of demographic and economic changes that have come to the United States that have also come to a lot of Western democracies where the Republican Party, the Conservative Party, is the party of rural areas, and the Democratic Party is the party of urban areas. And so what this means is that today, this rural bias means that today the Republican Party receives the benefits of these constitutional structures in the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. And it now means it's possible for the Republican Party to win national office without actually winning popular majorities. These institutions inflate the power of the MAGA movement, inflate the power of the Republican Party, and also thereby inflate the power of the MAGA movement. So let me just take the presidency. The Democratic Party has won the popular vote for the presidency 7 of the 8 last presidential elections. Republicans have won only once, in 2004, since 1989. 1988, actually, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And when I tell my 14 and 15-year-old daughters about this, I say, this is the year that Taylor Swift was born. The Republicans have only won the popular vote for the presidency one time since Taylor Swift was born. But Republicans have held the presidency for half the time since then. Consider America's second chamber, the US Senate. The Democratic Party has won the popular vote, if you count up all the votes for the Senate in each 6-year cycle, for the entire 21st century, yet Republicans have controlled the Senate for nearly half this period. Or think about the federal judiciary. Again, without retirement ages, what this means is that 3 of the current justices on the Supreme Court were nominated by a president who lost the popular vote and were confirmed by senators representing less than half the population. So these 3 key pillars, presidency, judiciary, and the Senate, make it easy for a political minority to govern. This is not a story of one party to blame or the other party. It's just a system that's obviously tilted in the favor of a rural party. And so America, which has this 30% minority faction, as many democracies do, because of these institutions, have an inflated power in the political system. This means that many of the policies that people care about in the United States, you think Americans are crazy about guns, majorities of Americans are in favor of gun control. Public opinion has lots of evidence showing Americans want more aggressive policies to deal with income inequality. Americans are supportive of abortion rights. But in every instance, these policy preferences are thwarted by our institutions. A final thing I'll say before concluding is to say that all of this is also having a feedback effect on the Republican Party. It's having a feedback effect, radicalizing even further the Republican Party. Because America's political institutions shield the Republican Party from competition, from true competition at the national level. Republicans, as I've said, have repeatedly underperformed in presidential races and midterm races for the last 20 years. But there's been no serious effort to rethink strategy. Normally in a democracy, like in the marketplace, if a firm loses money, you have to find new customers, come up with a new strategy. In a democracy, a party loses, it has to regroup, especially in a 2-party system, it has to regroup, come up with a new strategy, new faces. This has not really been happening in the Republican Party, and I think in large part this is because of the fact that it benefits from these institutions. It doesn't need to compete nationally to win. Republicans don't have to win national majorities, popular majorities to win power. Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016 with 46% of the vote. In 2020, it was estimated that Trump would win the presidency if he got only 47% of the vote. So in a 2-party system, the idea that you don't have to win a majority is pretty shocking. So the point here is that extremism doesn't cost the Republican Party as it would in a truly competitive environment. If Republicans actually had to win national majorities in order to govern, there would be incredible pressure to rein in their extremist base, to separate themselves from their extremist base. And so our institutions are having this effect of exacerbating the radicalization of the Republican Party. Now, what do we do about this? I mean, that's the second half of the title of the talk today. Well, I'm going to talk about, I would say, 2 things. One, we need to think, I think in all of our democracies, long-term and short-term. In the long term in the United States, I think it's critical to begin to think about how to democratize our democracy. Every country has different institutions that need to be reformed in different ways. So what I'm going to propose here doesn't necessarily apply to Austria or Germany or any other country. But in the United States, because of this effect of these pre-democratic institutions, we make the case that we need to replace the Electoral College with direct presidential elections. Every other democracy on earth that had an Electoral College has gotten rid of it, except for the United States. We need to democratize the Senate by eliminating the filibuster, this rule that requires supermajorities to vote on anything. This doesn't require a constitutional amendment, just a simple vote in the Senate. We need to establish term limits for Supreme Court justices. One of the proposals we have, I was talking to Sebastian earlier, that sounds radical to Americans, but incredibly boringly conventional in Europe, is that we shouldn't have elections on a weekday, and we shouldn't require people to have to register to vote ahead of time. But these are actually, some of these are very hard to achieve, and none of these are going to be achieved before November 2024. That's certainly the case. So this is long term, and I think in order to think about the long-run health of democracy and the viability of two parties, we need to begin to think about these reforms. But what about in the United States before November 2024, and what to do now in Europe? So I think the threat, the immediate threat in many ways is very similar. A minority faction, MAGA movement, AfD in Germany, that is a threat to democracy, and that if it were to gain power would represent a serious shock to our systems. So what can be done in the short run? And I want to conclude by just going through 4 different strategies for how to think about how to respond to these internal threats from within. The first is what you can kind of think as a kind of classical liberal laissez-faire response. It's the, sort of in a way the American response. Facing illiberalism, the classical liberal would say, let all opinions compete. John Stuart Mill called this the collision of adverse opinions. And it's only in this way that the classical liberal says you don't use the state, you don't use physical force to eliminate competitors for power you don't like. That's anti-democratic to do. You just let good ideas beat out bad ideas. Let good candidates and good parties beat bad candidates and bad parties. Now this is, there's a power in this, of course, but of course it leaves our systems vulnerable to those who would cheat, those who would break the rules, those who will use the institutions of democracy to dismantle it. So that's so much for the first answer. I mean, I think there's a power in it, but there's also some limits. And it's in response exactly to these limits that the second approach emerged out of the 1930s in Germany and in Europe, this notion of the wehrhafte Demokratie, militant democracy is how it's translated in English. From this point of view, it's insane to let illiberal ideas onto the same stage as liberal ideas and liberal tactics because it's an uneven fight. Those who want to destroy democracy will play dirty and they will win. So of course the core idea of a militant democracy, instead of a kind of John Stuart Mill response, we say use the state, the rule of law, to distinguish between those ideas and parties that are a threat to democracy and those that aren't. Even if you disagree with a party and find their ideas offensive, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a threat to democracy. Determine which parties are a threat to democracy, have a rule of law process that can investigate these parties and potentially ban them. Investigate them and ban them. I mean, this is what happened in Germany in the 50s with the banning of the Communist Party as well as a successor to the Nazi Party. This has been more recently used in Brazil, where the Supreme Electoral Court banned former President Bolsonaro from running for president again. And this was even considered in the United States this past year when there was an effort to say that Donald Trump ought not be able to be on the ballot because he was an insurrectionist, and the 14th Amendment in the United States coming out of the Civil War prohibits insurrectionists from holding federal office. But the Supreme Court said that the rule didn't apply. Now, it's clear that this is a powerful mechanism, but it's such a powerful mechanism in many ways, it's too powerful. Because, of course, the question is how does a democracy protect itself from the abuse of these incredibly powerful tools? So that's the weakness of this approach. There's a third strategy. I'm just laying these on the table, not quite making judgments about them yet. Third strategy, which is the one that I think many democracies people have begun to embrace, which is building broad governing electoral coalitions to isolate and defeat anti-democratic extremists. This strategy also has historical roots in the 30s in Belgium. The Catholics and the socialists hated each other, you could imagine, yet they joined together to keep the fascists out of power, and this worked for a while. This is, I think, the strategy that motivated helped bring Joe Biden to power in 2020, where you had Republicans who didn't like Donald Trump and thought Donald Trump was a threat to democracy, rallying and defending and supporting Joe Biden. And it's the idea, I think, that's behind the hope, I think, behind the 2024 election in the United States, that Republicans like Liz Cheney would join forces with Democratic socialists like Bernie Sanders. You can't imagine two people with less in common, but they do agree and recognize threats to democracy, and they should be voting for the same candidates and working for the same political goals. In Germany, this means all coalitions ranging from the Left Party to the CDU and Thüringen need to join forces to isolate the AfD. Now, this is a powerful and I think quite effective response, and one that I think is appropriate, but it's worth noting that it's really a short-term strategy. The history of grand coalitions in Austria, the history of grand coalitions elsewhere show that the problem with this over the long run is that it undermines the legitimacy of the system. Democracy is supposed to be about competition. If the main parties just get together and exclude the other parties, over the long run, this just reinforces the narrative of collusion that outsiders often make. So I think it's a viable strategy in the short run, but we can't sort of rest with that alone. The final and fourth strategy that I think is also important is a strategy I'll call the strategy of social mobilization. So what do I mean by this? I mean that one answer to the dilemma of coping with illiberalism in your own political system is to mobilize democratic social forces, societal, civil society forces in favor of democracy. This means community organizations, neighborhood associations, business associations, labor unions, religious leaders and organizations, publicly defending democracy and condemning extremism. This may mean people in the streets. This really means civil society of all sorts, liberal, social democratic, green, and conservative. Business leaders, religious leaders, labor leaders, joining together to confidently assert, and I'll put it this way, the normative foundations of democracy. What is allowed in our societies and what is not. Reminding citizens of what our shared democratic norms are. Reminding citizens of where the red lines are. And when the red lines begin to fade, repainting the red lines. This is, I think, what's actually been happening in Germany since January of this year in response to the Potsdam meeting that you talked about at the beginning. I have found that inspiring. Certainly not enough, but I think it's very important. The power of civil society in the US in the 1960s, in a very different setting, was critical to dismantling the racial authoritarianism of the Jim Crow era. I mean, it was church, again, remember, it was not just people in the streets, it was organizations, labor, religious leaders, civil rights groups. So it's the power both of a democratic vision, a power of democratic organization. And the most important challenge, though, is staying united in the face of a common challenge, because it can be very tricky, as I think we've seen in Germany, when we see Antifa, people protesting and bankers protesting, they don't particularly like each other very much, but they may all have a shared commitment. And I think similarly, Liz Cheney and Bernie Sanders might not like each other or might disagree on almost everything, but they have to remember the things that they agree on. And there's a song, Pete Seeger song from the civil rights era, where he said this, and this was a song that motivated the civil rights era. The song was, the key line in the song was, "Keep your eye on the prize." Keep your eye on the prize, meaning remember what's most important. And there's lots of things that can divide a democratic coalition: foreign policy disagreements over Israel, Hamas, over immigration, over climate issues. But without a joint commitment to democracy, all of these other issues become secondary. So holding the social coalition is necessary. Democracy depends upon it. Thank you.
Thank you.